Economic structuralism is rooted in the ideas of Karl Marx, a German political economist who lived in the 19th century and is famous for being the theorist behind Marxism, communism, socialism, and so on. And so what we're going to do here is talk just a little bit about Marx's economics and how he links what he thinks of as basic economics to economic exploitation and political exploitation. So let's just start with this. Here's a painting, a representation of a German steel factory in the 1870s, roughly the time that Marx was writing. And you see a couple of things here that are worth pointing out. One is there's some raw materials in the form of steel. There's a factory, obviously, that somebody has set up. And there are these workers working with the steel to create a finished product. So these are the kinds of things, the inputs into the economy that Marx was thinking about. So Marx invented what's called the value theory of labor. And the idea is pretty simple, right? Is that if you take some raw materials, in this case, iron ore or pig iron, and you add some labor to them, you get a finished product, right? Might be a part of a gun or a wheel for a car or a train, could be anything, right? Raw materials plus labor, in Marx's view, gets you a finished product. And his idea is that if you take the cost of the raw materials and then you take the cost of the finished product, whatever that difference is must be the value of the labor, right? So when you add labor to raw materials, you produce new value. And Marx asks the question, how does that surplus value, the difference between the value of the raw materials and the value of the finished product, how does that get divided between the person who provided the labor and the person or the people who own the factory, right? That's a simple question. How does that additional wealth get divided up? And you can guess what his answer is going to be, right? His answer is simply that the factory owners get most of it, right? They control the factories. They can lock the doors of the factories. They can lay people off. They can fire you. So that they use their control of the factories to force the workers to work for low wages. And Marx argued that this is inevitable under capitalism, because under capitalism, those who own capital, by which we mean either the factories themselves or land or the money to buy those things with, they have power, and workers basically are told, take it or leave it. And we all kind of have some experience with this, right? If we've ever had any kind of job, you might not like what they're paying you too much, but you sort of have the sense that, well, negotiating with your boss for more is not really much of an option, right? It's either take it or leave it. This is the wage. You make the choice. But Marx argued not only that this is inevitable under capitalism, but that it's inevitable under capitalism that capitalists will squeeze and squeeze and squeeze until the workers get so desperate that they will rise up and overthrow the system. So for Marx, revolution was both necessary to overcome this system, and therefore it would become inevitable, because any other way of dealing with the problem simply would not work, he argued. I should point out that conventional economics has really discredited this notion of surplus value. There's really no reason to think about it the way that Marx does, that all the difference between prices of raw materials and outputs are somehow all attributed to labor. That's a kind of an artificial way of thinking, but nonetheless, it's a powerful way of thinking, and Marx took it a long way. Well, how does this apply to international politics? When we think about, back to our prisoner's dilemma, and the liberals see cooperation as getting from a bad result to a good result, Marxists are much more skeptical about what the results are from international cooperation. And Marxists are especially much more skeptical about the liberal support for free trade. And so here we're not just talking about Marxists generally, but specifically the school of thought that I've called in the textbook economic structuralism. Because they argue that the structure of international trade, the basic rules of the game, lead not so much to free trade, but to unequal exchange, in which those who are wealthy to begin with get most of the benefits from exchange, and those who are poor to begin with get a fairly small part. The result being, right, and this is a key point for economic structuralists, that when trade occurs, the gap between the rich and the poor tends to grow rather than shrinking. And so therefore, where liberal sees international cooperation as a happy world, economic structuralists and Marxists tend to see it as a world of exploitation. So that's a brief nutshell on treatment of Marxism and economic structuralism. So the question I want to ask you is, which parts of that seem radical? Which parts maybe seem uncontroversial?